There's always 3 topics for us to talk about, but in this case, we're going to be doing the first one as easy, second as medium, third as hard. So, number 1 is talking about patch stacking and changing each patch in the stack. I know this looks like a lot, but only look at this one right here, normal. So, if I had only pulled up this patch, I called it LD, go figure, but this is my Flume one. If I only used this one, here's what it would have sounded like. Okay, that sounds okay, but this is a pretty easy trick that you can do with any preset ever. Copy several versions of the patch and get different tracks going so that you have a low version, a medium one, and a high one. And on top of that, you're going to want to not just stack them so it's the same sound, you want to change each one a little bit. So here's now what the sound is. Sounds way fatter, sounds way bigger, and overall a lot wider because I have more sources to help spread the stereo image. When you go about changing each track, you want it to match what that sound is going for. So over here on the left, I've got low. This is the lower octave. What I did was I changed the pitch. Okay, that's normal. But I also changed the first effect to be not a chorus anymore, but a classic tube, which is more fitting for a bass. On top of that, I changed the filters so it was a little bit different than the other two. And those things together made this a much better bass patch than it was initially. Now, that sounds pretty good, but listen to it in the mix just as the bass patch. It sounds fine, but it's missing a lot of that higher end crispiness. Enter mid-range. Here's what the mid-track sounds like. By itself, it sounds a little harsh, panned right, and it's not holding its own weight very much. But with the low patch, now listen to them together. Here's what I changed about the mid patch. The mid patch only really had one main difference, and that was this oscillator's pitch. They're all going to be in their correct octaves, so if you look at the different pitches, they're all over the place. But if you look here, the high one is at 0, so it's where the patch begins. The low one was set 2 octaves below to cover the bass. But then right here, we have -5, -17, and -8. None of those have anything to do with an octave. That's because this guy's job is to be a perfect fifth. If you're not familiar with music theory, just know that 7 semitones up or 5 semitones down is a perfect fifth, again by itself. It has that weird element that would suck by itself, but complements the other two quite well. Here's the song with just the mid patch. Not bad, but not great. Here's the song with just the high patch. Now to make this all work, you don't need to change all 3 necessarily. If you change 2, that will by definition make all 3 different. That's why this main one called high is basically the patch by itself, normal. I've got the wobble macro on just like I do on all of these, but nothing else has really changed. But again, by itself, it doesn't sound nearly as good as it does with all 3. So in short, you want to take your normal patch, throw it an octave down, throw it to another good interval that sounds sweet with the rest, and tweak them all a little bit, EQ them so that they fit where they're supposed to, and you've got a sweet patch that's going to sound better than the preset did by itself. Next up, we're going to be talking about the X-Fade, Sequence Fader, and Wobble shaping. Personally, I really like to know what things are actually called, and so I don't just point to something and say, this thing. So this technically is called the Sequence Morph Control. Ooh. So if you listen to Flume or any similar artists, you'll notice that they all have one pretty similar thing in common, and that is making their wobbles and making their tracks off the grid. The drums, the synth patches, they all tend to have this kind of ebb and flow to them, so they're not strictly locked into the grid. Electro and progressive house tend to be very strict, very on the grid. Kick drums are always going to be on 1, 2, 3, and 4. Everything's pretty orderly. With these off-the-grid artists, you'll notice the kicks, the hi-hats, the snares, and the basses are all not locked up into typical subdivisions. That's fancy speak for turn off this knob. So most common ways to get a wobble is just pull up an LFO and use this sine wave. Sounds very rigid, sounds pretty locked in, good for some types of music, not great for this off the grid type. Even if I just turn off sync, listen to what it sounds like. It still has a pretty familiar wobble sound. This topic is going to be encouraging you to try to experiment with different shapes from not just an LFO, but also the Performer. If you're not familiar with how to use the Performer, you click on Load Curve, and it has all these other options that aren't your standard sine wave and other stuff that you're going to find in your LFO. In your LFO, you do have a big old list, but there's another reason that I like using the Performer. If you use a Performer and you use these shapes, number one, they're a little less crazy than all the other random LFO shapes. But number two, if you look at my cutoff here, my low point starts at wherever my knob is pointed at, and my high point is at wherever I tell it to go above that. Watch what happens to this point when I click on LFO. Now this is suddenly representing the middle of this graph here, and I have to account for what goes below and what goes above. Great in many circumstances, but there's going to be other times where you do just want this to be the low point or the high point. If I were to, for example, attach this Performer to the amp, and let's say it's pointed halfway, now I can just deal with turning it lower and off, rather than have to worry about, oh shit, it's going to go all the way up too. So then again, this shape isn't going to be your standard wobble, and this is what it sounds like. You could also do this shape. It stays up for a lot longer. You got this one. This one. And this one. Whatever version you choose is going to give you a slight deviation from your normal sine wave. But that's not the only reason I like to use this. Your Sequence Morph Control Fader allows you to do something cool. We've talked about this before. Your LFO has it too. It allows you to access this shape here as well. But your Performer is a little different. It allows you to utilize this shape down here, whatever you use, but you also have control over which of these shapes are utilized. First of all, watch what happens when this is all the way down and this is all the way off. We expect there to be no change. This is going to be a useless modulation because guess what? It's just a straight line. Now, why didn't this follow the X-Fade sequencer shape? These guys right down here is the cause of that. When these are activated, you're allowed to use both shapes. When these are off, you're only going to be utilizing this shape, no matter where this fader is. So in theory, you could always have this cool attack here that you're stoked on, and then get a hybrid for the second one. Listen to what happens if I leave the X-Fade fader in the middle, and then bring this one up. So these are going to have to play nice together. Now I don't have to worry about my strong attack phase when the wobble is going upwards. I don't have to worry about that getting affected by this stupid guy. Otherwise, it would have sounded something like this. Nothing close to the original sound, especially in this year with electronic music, as things are all starting to sound similar. There's a lot of shit going on. There's a lot of sounds. You need to make your sounds different as much as you can. This right here is a technique I'm sure not very many people are using, or I'm just being stupid. So, try this. Try this. It's cool. Last on the list is talking about the attack phase of your patch. Standard issue patches, we're all going to be assuming that the attack phase is just talking about envelope 4 attack knob. If I turn it up, it doesn't sound as crispy at the front end, and if I turn it all the way down, you get to hear it right away. But there is one other thing that I attach to this, and that is 4 macros that all affect the attack portion of this sound. A lot of people will end up having a wobble on, wobble off knob, but not these other 3. Let's hear what this sounds like with a longer note. Okay, sounds like a wobble. If we turn this off, now this is what the patch was initially when I made it. Very interesting attack phase. This macro right here says no attack. Listen to what this sounds like. We hear the whole thing right away. It changes around a little bit as time goes on, but not nearly as much as this. Now horror attack adds this darker element to it. And metal attack makes the first note sound very high-pitched metally, and I would probably end up EQing this more later, but it was a pretty interesting sound. So why do I focus so much on the attack phase and waste 4 macros changing how it sounds when I initially press play? The reason is that's what's going to set your sound apart from a standard lead. Leads are going to sound pretty much the same with whatever pattern you're using them for. If you want one section to really stick out as a transition, as a fill, as the beginning, as like a drop, you need to have different versions of the attack phase. It's not enough just to have one sound that plays pretty loud the whole time and hope that it's going to make your song sound good. That's just not very interesting. So adding different versions will allow you to make your songs more complex and suck less. Here's how I came up with each of these macros to affect the attack. The most obvious one was the wobble right here that I attached to the amp of Performer 8. So anywhere that I attach this performer, you can see on the filter, you can see it on the wavetable position, blah, 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 on the amp even, was now going to get affected by this macro. Now, when this is off, you would expect, however, to just hear this straight sound, but you don't. You hear this long attack. And the reason is when macro 4 is off, envelope 2 takes over and is just everywhere. You can see I used it on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 20 plus modulation targets that are all following envelope 2. If you look over here, this is envelope 2, and it looks like it's pretty accurate. It just goes. Give it a listen. For the wobble to actually be able to do its thing and do anything and go, this guy had to be deactivated. And that's why I attached macro 4 to the S loop level, the decay level or the sustain, and the attack level. So when this is turned all the way down, you'd be looking at this straight line. There are other ways to do that, but all of my routing options are pretty much gone because there's just so many things being routed to everything. So I had to be a little bit creative in order to make this guy work out. When I made this sound, I wanted it to be focused on having this long attack, which is why I only wanted a wobble to disable that attack. That's the only time that I didn't want to have that attack. Overall, all the things that 8 is attached to is making everything go higher and louder and then back down to quiet. If I have macro 4 turned all the way up, which is going to disable envelope 2, and I actually turn off the amp of this guy, all it's going to do is show you what it sounds like when envelope 2 is doing nothing. When I bring this guy back in, we get to hear everything get brighter and then darker. Confused? I hope so. So that was making macro 4 work for me. Macro 1 is a little bit simpler. All it does is it's attached to the actual attack and brings this knob all the way down. So now the sound is just going to start out right here and go up. So it's not going to be super quiet anymore. It's going to be average to loud. So it does evolve from here to here, but it's not having this initial attack anymore. Therefore, with this all the way up, it's called no attack. Number 2 is also pretty straightforward. All it's doing is turning up the frequency modulation of filter 1, daft. The takeaway here is it's called horror attack. And what I've noticed is that the filter FM tends to make things sound pretty weird and pretty ridiculous. So turning this up, now I've got the regular attack with this guy on. Without it. With it. More aggressive first part. Metal attack is also a pretty interesting new trick. There's 2 places this guy is attached. Number 1 is the wavetable position of oscillator 3, and number 2 is the side chain on the bypass. This is what makes this whole thing work. When my macro is down, you will hear no bypass. It will be as though this was right down here. When macro 3 is up, the bypass is up. So now this right here is a slave to the side chain. This is not allowed to go through without this guy's say-so. You can even see in the routing section that this is attached to oscillator 3. So anytime this is off, if I hadn't put this here, this would have no effect, and you would hear this metal attack sound. If you're unfamiliar with how bypass works, it allows you to choose one of your oscillators and just bypass all the bullshit in the middle and become a part of your sound later. Doesn't have to go through any of the filtering. It just plops on at the end at either your effects or EQ. This spout doesn't matter nearly as much as this one. You want to be able to control this without having to automate it, because if this is just on, it's going to stick its nose in every other macro that you've got. Listen to what happens when I turn on the wobble. Okay, that sucks. Dropper, what is this? That's kind of cool. But you can still hear it in the beginning. Horror attack, turning this on. It's everywhere. So that's why I usually didn't like messing with bypass, because you just couldn't do much else with it unless you remembered to go back and turn it up, turn it down, whenever you needed it. By attaching a macro to just control that and then making a couple interesting decisions like I did over here, just changing that a little bit, nothing crazy, you can have a lot more control over like a really interesting sound. So I hope you guys like the slightly new format. The last one is always going to be a little bit longer, and hope it just doesn't suck too much. Any mastering requests, shoot me an email at ryan@occstudios.com, and I'll be back next time with a sub kick.